Verhalenpodium.
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 The Other West Coast, The Other West Coast, The Other West Coast Productions.
My name is Kristen Hayford.
And I'm Lisa Koolhoven.
This is a story about our grandparents during the Second World War,
And how their stories represent two historical perspectives.
and how their experiences relate to our present day.
This is Bab and Bob.
Collateral damage. So this is Rotterdam, a port city in the north of Europe that I've gotten to know. It's a bustling commercial hub that is really international. Rotterdam is part of the metropolitan region on the western side of the Netherlands, also including the cities of Amsterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague. My name is Kristen Hayford, and I moved to The Hague in 2021 with my Dutch husband. I'm a political scientist and digital marketer by trade, and I swapped the famous Santa Ana winds of Southern California for code oranjes that warn people of heavy winds, and my car for a bicycle. I started my own company, The Other West Coast Productions, as a home for my work and a nod to where I come from. As part of the process for attaining my residency permit, I've been familiarizing myself with the region and the country's history. I'm doing this through my Dutch integration program, which is required for non-EU citizens. I was so impressed by the program, which to me felt like, let us help you new residents succeed so the Netherlands succeeds. A stark contrast to America's pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach. At one point, my case manager set me up with a reporter, hired to interview me about my experience integrating. And that is when I met Lisa Koolhoven, who would become my friend.
I'm a historian and a freelance journalist, and I met Kristen while interviewing her for the city. They had made changes to their integration program and wanted to see how participants were responding. After interviewing Kristen, we soon found out we share an interest in World War II. She explained how it was new to her to see old bunkers, plaques, and memorials in the Netherlands. Being Dutch, I'm used to it. And as a historian, I'm familiar with the history behind it. My family has its own story about World War II, which I share as a tour guide in Rotterdam. The tour starts at Museum Rotterdam, where the school classes and people I take on the tour assemble, and where we see an impressive reconstruction of how Nazi bombs leveled the city center in 1940. At the time, Rotterdam had the largest port in Europe, and so it was a strategic location to attack. Nazi Germans bombed the city on May 14, 1940. The day before, our queen and the government had fled to England. This bombing brought our whole country to its knees. It was the beginning of the 5-year Nazi occupation of the Netherlands.
As an American, it was hard for me to grasp that my new home had been occupied by the Nazis. I found it wild that the Dutch parliament has maintained hundreds of years of their government's records. As an American approaching our country's 250th anniversary, 800 years makes us feel so young. But out of those records, 5 years are missing, and those 5 years are between 1940 and 1945. As I learned, the impact of Nazi occupation on Dutch civilians was extremely harsh, and for Dutch Jews, it was lethal.
The Nazis introduced new rules restricting life in occupied Netherlands. Nightly curfews, fuel and food got rationed, and men were being forced to leave their families to work in Germany. The lives of the 140,000 Dutch Jewish citizens got increasingly restricted, up until the point 107,000 of them were deported and almost all of them killed. Following the 1940 bombing, the people of Rotterdam began to immediately rebuild and move forward. My grandmother, whose name was Beb van der Belt, was living in Rotterdam with her family. She also had this roll-up-your-sleeves Rotterdam mentality. Because of the Great Depression, her dad had been without a job for 7 years. And my grandmother herself, she couldn't find a job after graduating from teaching school. War changed all that. Beb could start substituting for sick teachers, since the war made people ill. Also, as uncomfortable as it is to realize, Jewish teachers who were in hiding or being deported left open teaching roles. Beb would teach in 25 different schools in those 5 years, crisscrossing the city on her bicycle.
We face this new crisis, this new threat to the security of our nation.
In Washington, the 1940 bombing of Rotterdam set off alarm bells. This bombing from the air was new and dangerous. The largest port in Europe was now cut off. The Nazis effectively blocked Europe from the inside out. In a speech to Congress, President Roosevelt pleaded for funds to build up American forces.
The Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, but also to enslave the whole of Europe.
It had always been a known story in my family that we lost our family house because of a bombing in Rotterdam. I can still hear my grandmother, Oma Beb, and her sister joking about how the sister fled their house in only her house slippers. And they quarreled about who took what from the house before it burned to the ground. After my graduate studies in history, I was assigned to interview a survivor of the 1940 Rotterdam bombing. I immediately thought of my grandmother, but she kept mentioning 1943. So I was like, sorry grandma, wrong bombing. I did some research and learned that Rotterdam was bombed in 1943, and it was done by the Allies, the military coalition consisting of primarily the US and the UK, and this bombing is now known as the Forgotten Bombing of 1943. Later in her life, when my grandmother's dementia began to set in, we started speaking about it and going through old photo albums. That's when I noticed this bombing was more present in her mind than ever. Together, we made a book with pictures and stories of her life, starring The Forgotten Bombing. I now learned about her experiences and combined them with the facts I researched. With that, I designed a bicycle tour for Museum Rotterdam to retrace her bike route from that day, March 31st, 1943. As I got to know Kristen, I invited her to join me on the tour.
I thought it was really interesting that Lisa made a museum tour retracing her grandmother's steps. It made me think of my own grandfather, Bob Burton, who was a fighter pilot during the war. I printed out a photo of him in his pilot gear and brought it with me so I could share with Lisa a piece of my own family history, like she will share with us on her bike tour.
Dit is mijn oma. Ja, het is nog Beb van Belt.
Since the tour was in Dutch, I did my best to follow along. Much of the path we rode had been rebuilt, so Lisa brought old photos for us to see what it used to look like.
After 2 hours on the bicycle, we end at the museum cafe, and that is when Kristen pulled out a surprise.
Yes, this is when I proudly pulled out a picture of my grandfather. In my naive American way, I had not registered that this particular bombing that Lisa's grandmother survived wasn't done by the Nazi German pilots. We just toured this neighborhood that our side had destroyed.
It was an accident. They were trying to hit shipyards under Nazi control, but missed and hit my grandmother's neighborhood next door. When Kristen joined the tour and showed me the photo, it actually made me realize that I didn't know much about the people executing this bombing. Who were the guys on the planes? Who destroyed my family home?
I never thought about what my grandfather did during the war, other than flying. Could he have been part of this Allied mission that accidentally bombed a residential neighborhood? I never imagined the harm, especially accidental. You know, we really don't talk about it in America, but this was a very common reality for the people of the Netherlands during war.
I thought it was so cute that Kristen shared this photo of her grandfather. I even took a photo of her holding it. But deep down I felt uneasy. And as a historian, maybe a little ashamed. I knew they were the Allied forces, but I didn't give it more thought. Like, was it the Americans or the British? And now, being confronted with someone whose grandpa was an American pilot, I felt forced to add another perspective to my grandmother's story. the one I had so carefully reconstructed together with her.
I wanted to know more. I was checking in with my family, and they were able to point me to some books that I was able to find in secondhand bookstores online. These books chronicled the day-to-day routine of pilots like my grandfather, who was only 19 when he enlisted and started training just after Pearl Harbor. He, like many young men, showed up for this call to action. In fact, in some instances, I found his name mentioned, Lieutenant Robert E. Burton. We, of course, knew him as Bob. I became obsessed. It was like a treasure hunt, but I knew that I might not like what I would find.
I recall several coffee dates with Kristen, and she would bring another pile of books, eagerly sharing her findings and discoveries. She won me over to join her in finding out what Opa Bob did on March 31st, 1943.
I asked my cousin to share the letters my grandpa wrote home to his mother. Growing up, I had heard about these letters, but I never read them. He helped me by scanning them so I could read them in the Netherlands. In total, there were over 40 letters that traced his time beginning with basic training to his nearly 100 bombing missions over Europe.
I was so touched by all these letters, especially by the casual tone between mother and son.
Yeah, I even found a letter from his mother addressing him as, "My dear son Bob. Hey, sweet, how's the war going?"
Yeah.
I was happy to convince Lisa to join me on this quest. I realized it wouldn't be an easy one for both of us, and what we might discover. Was there a chance my grandfather was part of the March 31st Allied mission on Rotterdam? In seeking the answer, I was met with resistance. Some of my family didn't want me to poke around in his legacy and put in question his military service. But this was part of my experience getting to know the Netherlands, a country where I now live, and a country that coincidentally has a connection to my grandfather.
All this time, Kristen and I discussed doing a podcast, but I really tried not to push too hard because she was having trouble convincing her family. As a historian, though, I was fascinated and I really wanted to know more. So once Kristen was ready, I connected with a fellow tour guide at Museum Rotterdam. His name is Wouter Hagemeyer, a military historian.
All right, Wouter. We want your speaking, so
Okay.
I'm going to put it right next to you.
Okay, no problem. I hope.
When we went to meet Wouter, we learned that Rotterdam was not a difficult target to spot from the sky.
You can find it easily because it's on a river, it's not too far inland, and with all the harbors extending the river, it's easily to recognize. And Rotterdam was a freshman target.
I contacted the Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force, my grandpa's unit. They were able to send me a copy of the records from the mission that day. Seeing the route and the logbook made me kind of emotional. This really happened, and so much went wrong. A truly awful day. As Wouter explained to us, on the morning of March 31st, 1943, 102 Allied bomber planes took off from different bases in England, each carrying 10 Americans on board, barreling 1,000 young men across the North Sea into Nazi-occupied Europe. 25 Americans were killed just because of the bad weather, and 2/3 of the aircraft decided to return to England for the same reason. One of these aircrafts was so damaged that it crashed over England, killing another American. 33 bombers did continue on to occupied Netherlands, and they thought they recognized the target.
So all the bombers had to navigate to the target, which proved to be a problem. Finding the target was a problem. The next problem was hitting the target. The Brits calculated in early 42 that only 5% of the bombs fell in a radius of 5 miles.
A third of the bombers continued on for their target of shipyards near Rotterdam. The Nazi Germans were supposedly building submarines there. Half of the planes returned to England after hitting targets, so they thought. 16 planes went even further. The leading aircraft mistook the working-class neighborhood of my grandmother for their target. Shortly before 1:30 p.m., these bombers dropped 1,000-pound bombs, 96 in total. Only 40 seconds later, all of these bombs would hit, ultimately killing 453 Dutch citizens. 16,500 people were left homeless. One of those people was my grandmother, Beb. I now realize it was not just one plane dropping one bomb on Oma Beb's neighborhood. In one of the books my grandmother had about the bombing, there is a picture of a bomb crater in front of their family home. In her dry Rotterdam way, she marked out with a pencil, "This is where we used to live on the 2 top floors." The equivalent of 40 soccer fields were wiped out by almost 100 bombs in less than a minute. This was new information for me to consider. I had been giving a bike tour about it, and I didn't even know all this.
The scale of this bombing was really hard for me to comprehend. I tried imagining 1,000-pound bombs dropping over my California neighborhood as a kid, destroying our family home. We are pretty accustomed to natural disasters, like wildfires and earthquakes, but not bombs raining from the sky. The more I learned, the more uncomfortable I also felt about the possibility of my grandfather being involved. I went back to his letters. What could he have been doing that day in 1943? I patiently read through his handwritten letters from start to finish. Bob spoke about his dreams of becoming a pilot. I was reading and found this one that kind of made me giggle. "Dear Mother, here it is, the beginning of the end of a 10-year-old dream of mine. I don't know how it's going to end, though. Maybe with a commission, or maybe tomorrow when I take that flight physical examination. Anyway, it is great to be a cadet, even if for only a few days. Instead of being addressed as, 'Hey, soldier,' or something to that effect, it is Mr. Burton this or Mr. Burton that. Oh boy, and how I like these cadet uniforms. With white gloves, too, for parading. The mess is tops also, with regular plates to eat off of and everything."
Off we go into the wild sky yonder, keep the wings level and true.
The U.S. was in the process of building the largest armed forces the world had ever seen. I found Jimmy Stewart telling Americans in a newsreel.
Right now, the greatest mass mobilization in the history of the world is taking place. Men from cities, towns, farms, married men and single men, brothers, sweethearts, husbands, fathers and sons, businessmen and workers from the factories, and students from colleges and high schools all over America. They're mobilizing, joining up, or having their numbers pulled out of a fishbowl. And this war we're fighting today and tomorrow and the next day until we win is a war of the air. The whole world knows that.
My grandfather Bob eventually tested to become a pilot. It would take many months before he would be deployed and stationed in East Wretham, England. Here's Wouter.
And what I found interesting in the letters your grandfather wrote, the time it took to train a pilot. All kinds of military training. You have your primary school, you have your basic school, your advanced school, and then your operational training. And you have to realize that the United States started with no army at all, or very small. And so you had to start from scratch, and then it takes some time, and then they started to crank out enormous amount of planes, but also trained pilots. And they could afford to do that. Because I think that most of the Allied fighter pilots, before they deployed and had their first combat mission, had already 400 or 500 flying hours, compared to a German fighter pilot in those days with only 100.
Months before he would be sent to Europe, Bob was itching to fly. Here he is in Westover Field, Massachusetts, writing home to his mother. "Dear Mother, it seems to me that it is about time I let you know where I am and what I'm doing. Baldridge, Bus, and a few other friends of mine are here with me. We are in a fighter squadron, flying P-47s. I don't know how long we will be here. On the way up here, Baldy and I stopped over at his home. His folks were very nice, and his young brother thought we were Supermen or something. He is crazy to get into the Air Corps. Since we have been here, all we have done is read about this plane. No flying yet. It's driving me crazy staying on the ground. Well, I can't seem to write, so I will say all is okay for now." And the date on this letter was March 30th, 1943.
Oh, Kristen, if that was March 30th, that means your grandfather wasn't even in Europe when my grandmother was bombed by accident in 1943.
Wow, I was so relieved to read that he was still in the States. But now I'm even more curious about what he would experience once he got deployed, when he would go on to escort bomber planes all over Europe and the Netherlands.
Yeah, and now that I've learned so much about the pilots, I am curious to learn more about their experiences.
And really getting a new understanding of what life was like in the Netherlands during the war. Imagining having to rebuild from the rubble with limited food and resources under Nazi occupation. This was a war of the air. They were consistently targeting shipyards, airports, ports, oil supplies, and railway tracks to slow down the Nazi war front. But there were still civilians living among all these targets. So we also want to know what happened to Oma Beb and her neighbors.
We both want to know more. So we decide to continue our research. Another colleague from the museum suggested Kristen and I go on a private plane ride to get some idea of what it might have been like for Opa Bob to be up in the sky. We thought it would be hugely expensive, but it turned out to be doable. Kristen and I went for a private 4-seater plane ride ourselves.
The plane lifted off like a little bird with grace and no force. It was possible to make out the landscape below. We flew up the southern border of The Hague, down to the Dutch coastline, towards Rotterdam. As we approached Oma Beb's neighborhood, it struck me how close it was to the shipyard the Allies were targeting. It was a startling perspective looking down from the air, compared to the ground perspective we get from Lisa's bike tour.
While on the plane, even being at 500 meters, I had this feeling of complete solitude, approaching Rotterdam from the open sea. To imagine what it would have been like for Kristen's granddad at over 24,000 feet up, sitting alone in a plane, facing army artillery and extreme temperatures, trying to guide his bomber colleagues to a target in occupied territory. Even though I recognize Rotterdam, I find all that water of different harbors, rivers and canals quite confusing. Not easy to pinpoint exactly where we were, let alone for those men who had no knowledge of the city from the ground. I could clearly see Oma Beb's neighborhood by the old windmill that survived the bombing. We always stopped there on my bike tour, where I showed this beautiful piece of Rotterdam that was not destroyed by Nazi nor Allied bombs. On the bike tour I lead, we follow the route Oma Beb took that day. She told me she was teaching at a primary school in the city center when she heard the bomb alarms go off. After that, she heard the bombs being dropped. You did wonder where they would land this time, she said. Since these bombings were common, she took care in finishing her program with the kids before heading for her family home by bike. Coincidentally, that day, someone at a radio studio heard the alarm. He pointed his mic outside the window and recorded the alarm and the bomb droppings. The studio was as far from Oma Beb's neighborhood as the city center where she was teaching that day. So loud. And she stayed for the kids. During her 10-minute bike ride home, Oma Beb recalled how anxious she felt about the amount of smoke, dust and paper scraps coming towards her. When she arrived at her house, the windows were blown out and half of the front door was gone. But out of reflex, she still used her house key to let herself in. That is when she started searching for her sister, who had stayed home sick that day. She couldn't find her, and as she had seen other neighboring houses already on fire, she collected items that seemed important at the time. A pretty dress for her and her sister and some blankets, which she piled over the front of her bike before heading for her grandmother's house, which was their family's agreed safe location. Both her parents arrived later that day, and it was only after a terrifying night of uncertainty that her sister showed up the next morning, and the family was whole again.
Our plane ride over Rotterdam gifted me a new perspective of the pilots as well as the civilians on the ground. This all really happened, and it was completely devastating.
My grandmother's sister had never shared much about the experience, and I wasn't able to get more stories from my own family. At a presentation Wouter and I did at the museum around the 80th anniversary of the Forgotten Bombing, I was approached by an older lady. There and then she shared that she had been only 6 years old at the time, and that in her dream she could still hear the screaming of one of her neighbors who was trying to escape the top floor that was on fire. I remember that lady, Mrs. Wapenaar. Through the museum we reconnected. Kristen and I met her husband and son at her house.
Ja. Want geluid van die bommen bedoel je?
Mrs. Wapenaar went back to that moment in 1943 in which she, as a 6-year-old, could hear the bombers approach and the bombs being dropped.
Nou in één keer, bom, nou dan.
She was horrified.
En de stenen die vielen naar beneden uit het huis.
Her mom tried to find shelter with her and her baby brother under the coat rack. Before they knew, bricks were dropping on their heads and they had to flee outside. Her dad was at work just around the corner and had never been more relieved to hear his son crying. The young Mrs. Wapenaar was put on the pavement with her brother, forming a small creche around her. More and more parents put their children in her care while they were trying to save furniture before their houses would be completely destroyed.
It was impressive to me how vividly she shared details with us that even her own family didn't know about.
En daar stond wij dus.
Just a few days after our interview, Mrs. Wapenaar passed away, and suddenly our interview felt almost holy. I felt so lucky we got to meet her and hear her share her experience with us before she died.
Her son sent us a message the morning after she had died. It must have also been unreal for him when he thought about her so brightly telling her stories to us. She is gone now, but her memories and stories will remain, was what he wrote. After my grandmother's house burned down to the ground, she and her family were very lucky to get a new house within 3 weeks in the only new housing development that was finished in Rotterdam during the war. Through a family member, they found a house there, all the way on the other side of the city. They missed their whole network of people who were vital in helping them get food and fuel, and they didn't have any of their belongings. Family from the other side of the country loaned them furniture, so they didn't have to sleep on the floor.
I just didn't learn about this, what collateral damage looked like during the war, and what it's like to live after you've been bombed out of your home, all while living in the strict conditions of Nazi occupation. But this is the reality of war. The truth exists in the gray areas. It's not all black and white.
Neither Mrs. Wapenaar nor my grandmother blamed the Americans for the mistaken bombing. I did sense a deep need with my grandmother to have her loss acknowledged. She would never say it, but it was there. Even for me as a historian, it had always been about the 1940 Nazi bombing of Rotterdam, and the 1943 Allied bombing was forgotten. Now we know 453 Dutch citizens died in that bombing, and 16,500 people lost their homes. My grandmother kept newspaper clippings about the bombing that my aunt found after my grandmother's death. She sent them to me for this podcast project. One of the clips referred to a documentary from 1993, and Kristen and I watched it together.
Vader, nou hebben de Amerikanen, die hebben mijn moeder doodgegooid.
We were very touched by another survivor who shared her experience with the forgotten bombing in that documentary. She had lost her brother and mother because of this bombing. And as a child, she blamed the Americans. Her dad told her not to do that. They are on our side, he said.
Toen het om me door ging dringen, dat je denkt, de bevrijders, die hebben dat gedaan. Maar van mijn vader heb ik nooit geen verwijt gehoord eigenlijk.
As Lisa and I watched the documentary together, we saw that one of the American navigators was being interviewed for Dutch public television. His name was Parley W. Madsen. Here he is sharing his reflections from the March 31st bombing.
I kind of have an affinity for what they went through. Speaking personally, it was hard for me to either attack Belgium or Holland. because I felt that they were in this not by their own will, but because of treachery. And I knew that they were fighting subtly, but they were opposing the Germans. Other areas that I bombed, I didn't care. But those two countries, it was hard for me to actually fly missions against them.
This collateral damage was not just on the ground. The damage was also among his colleagues. Military pilots were part of the cost of war.
I've seen them come back with noses missing, rudders missing, half wings gone, engines out, and they still came back.
Not all of them came back. Parley Madson's reflections remind me of something I read in one of my books about my grandfather's fighter group. The chaplain, who went by Chappie, submitted informal reports of morale for the 359th Fighter Group. In January 1944, the chaplain reported a dip in morale due to 4 well-liked pilots who failed to return to base. It was then that he sensed the true gravity of war setting in among the pilots, that their return was not guaranteed. They would later go on record as being the first fighter group to unanimously vote in favor for a chaplain-led prayer before missions. Only 2/3 of the pilots made it home alive. By April 1944, Bob had been based in England for 6 months, escorting bombing missions over the Netherlands and Europe. By spring, he needed some time to blow off steam, so he went up to Scotland with his pal Baldy. He wrote home about it to his mom. "Dear Mother, there seems to be a lot for me to write about tonight, and it has been some time since I wrote you last, so I will try and make it good. First of all, I'm back to work again. My leave was over on the 6th of this month. Baldy and I had a very good time in Scotland. We didn't knock ourselves out, so we came home in good shape. It was like being in another world. I didn't know until I got up there what a rut I was in here. When I got back, the box of candy was here, and the candy sure was good. I know, because it didn't last an hour in this room."
To me, it's really amazing the way he wrote to his mother. It's really straightforward and open. And the way he talks about it, it's almost like he's trying to comfort her. Like, hey, your candy arrived and the guys liked it, but really not sharing anything about the hardship they have to go through every day.
Yeah, and reading on in his letters, I thought how short this nice feeling would last. Not long after, the Allies would invade the beaches of France. My grandfather Bob wrote home to his mother shortly after D-Day. "Dear Mother, you probably have guessed that I have been working hard these days. Hard work isn't the name for it, but I'm too tired to think of another. I don't mind the work, though, if it helps those boys on the beaches of France. I don't think any of them have the energy to write home tonight. Big Dog and Baldy received your cards. They said thanks and also said they would write you, but Big Dog is too lazy and Baldy is missing, so you won't hear from him. I have hopes that he is a prisoner of war." This was a constant reality for men in the air like my grandfather. The unknowns mixed with the need to carry on. My husband and I planned a trip to Normandy for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. It was about an 8-hour drive south from our house in The Hague. I wanted to be there, to feel the place, while also commemorate the bravery of the American soldiers. There was a public program, and on one of the days, we watched a men's choir from the States sing this tribute on Utah Beach, and it really touched me.
D-Day brought much hope to the occupied territories, but it would still be a long way to go. My grandmother, Oma Beb, continued her teaching in Rotterdam, now from a new address where it was hard for them to survive, especially during the hunger winter, where the Nazis blocked the Dutch cities from receiving any food. The hunger winter of 1944 and 45 would ultimately starve 20,000 Dutch civilians. Oma Beb also lost a lot of weight during the hunger winter and was malnourished by the time the war actually ended in May 1945. She and my grandfather got married as soon as they could, following liberation. My mother was born in 1949 and my aunt in the year after.
My grandfather Bob completed his first combat tour by September 1944. He would not return to Europe. Instead, the Army would send him to train new pilots. While home in California, he would go on a blind date with my grandmother and fall hard. The following day, he proposed, and they would wed in December 1944 and would go on to have 3 children, my mother, the youngest.
And one day you'll see we can live together. When all the world is
So, whatever happened to Baldy?
Baldy would go down over Germany. He would survive his plane crash, but would be quickly discovered and interrogated by Nazi soldiers, tortured, and then killed. Following a fighter group reunion in 2002, my grandfather reconnected with Baldy's younger brother and later sent him a letter recalling some of his favorite moments with his older brother. One of the moments he actually had written also about to his mother during the war. Here's an excerpt. I am sure you remember that Baldy and I stopped by your mom and dad's home on our way to Westoverfield. I remember a small boy that followed every step his big brother took. The letter goes on to describe the feeling these new pilots had getting their first opportunity to fly the P-47 Thunderbolt. The plane Wouter had already noted was the Army's hottest bird. My grandfather Bob goes on to say that after passing his test on where all the plane's levers, gauges, and switches were while wearing a blindfold, they each got into their separate planes and waited for their turn to take off. He was a bit spooked by the 2,000 horsepower engine, and that his first flight in this plane would be solo, too tight to squeeze a trainer to fly with. I could go on with the rest of this day if I remembered any of it, but the truth is, I do not. I think I can safely say that Baldy and I bent our elbows a time or two at the club that night. I would like to relate more of Baldy's experience that day. I wish I could. It's just not there. I am sure that his day went on as well as mine did, and probably even better. Yours truly, Bob Burton.
Yeah, that's really sweet that he tries to inform the family a bit about the last days of his friend.
Right. For me, it's really sad that he just didn't remember much.
Yeah, I wonder if they didn't talk with one another that much in those days, or that your grandfather, he just forgot.
He wrote this letter in 2002, almost 60 years after the experience. I imagine, age just takes a toll at that point.
Yeah.
I do know my grandfather didn't share much about his experience during the war. We had stories in my family about him waking up with nightmares. He did at one point tell me I should join the Air Force.
Yeah.
Because flying planes was fun.
That you should join.
Yeah, that I should join. But yeah, I think by the time people were really interested in his experience, his memory had faded. But we did find another letter of his, or it was an address to his church congregation on the 60th anniversary of D-Day. Here he describes the missions he flew that day, but really what struck me was at the end of his address, he finds it really hard to comprehend the sacrifice and devotion that those men on the beach had and his colleagues. And for me, it's really shocking that someone could live through this war and still, 60 years later, be unable to comprehend what really they all went through. This process allowed me to comprehend what my grandfather and his friends went through, while also acknowledging the real cost of war on both pilots and civilians. It also made me feel closer to the people of the Netherlands, and I will always think of Oma Beb and her sister joking about leaving the house in their house slippers. ordinary people experiencing extraordinary things. I hope our story inspires others to revisit their own family histories.
It's a recipe, right? For quick friendship. Go find someone on a different side of history and do a podcast together. And I also share this now with participants on my bike tour. And also the perspective, of course, of Opa Bob and his colleagues. It was all new to me. And I now take that with me on the bike tour and I can share it with young participants. Like, hey, can you imagine it would be you enlisting in a year, flying over a different continent? Opa Bab, Opa Bob.
Oh, yeah,
Opa Bob, Oma Bab.
Yeah.
They're one person now.
They're one person.
They were both so young. You know, They were 22 when all this happened.
I learned so much from Oma Beb and what she went through.
Yeah, without Opa Bob, I would never gone up in this plane because I'm claustrophobic. It's still pretty special that you came. You know, you came and saved us from occupation. For a long time, I guess, this was like, okay, that's what the Americans do. And the world looks different today. But still, it's in our collective memory in the Netherlands, in Europe, that the Allied forces did this.
You know, you look back in the safety of time, knowing, okay, this is how it ended. But for the people who went through it, you had no idea what the next day would bring.
We can be proud of them.
Yeah, very.
Thank you for listening to Bab and Bob Collateral Damage. If you enjoyed listening to our story, please consider a donation to our Patreon page, linked in the show notes and on babbob.nl. Your support will allow us to continue sharing stories like the one you just heard.
This is a combined production of Verhalen Podium and the Other West Coast Productions. Thank you for listening to Beb and Bob Collateral Damage. We are your hosts and show creators, Kristen Hayford
and Lisa Koolhoven. Marco Raaphorst is the editor and producer of our Dutch version and composed the music for both versions.
Zachary Goldberg is our American producer and sound engineer.
Kitty Eisel is our editor and story producer for the American version.
Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions.
Glitter Studio did the artwork for the show. We want to thank our sources.
Wouter Hagemeyer,
Mevrouw Wapenaar and her family,
Jeanette and Jan van der Kolk.
Your willingness to talk with us and share your experiences means the world to us.
Thank you to our museum partners and historical associations, including the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force, the West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, the U.S. National Archives, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum of the National Archives and Records Administration, the 359th Fighter Group historians and authors Janet Fogg and Charlotte Baldridge,
Museum Rotterdam, the book Target Rotterdam, which describes the more than 300 Allied bombings on the Rotterdam area, Beeld en Geluid, Afro Televisier. We also want to thank our funders, all our family and friends and colleagues who supported our Woordenkunst campaign. Gemeente Rotterdam, het Cultuurfonds. Thank you to our family and friends who supported us on this 2-year journey. My husband, Michael Reuters, and mijn schoonouders for their love and support. My uncle, Roger Burton, my cousin, Stephen Wagner, and my parents, Jeannie and Michael Hayford, and of course the rest of my gezin, whom I love and miss. My mother, Els van der Schalk, and her sister, Arine Lodewijk, and her family, who supported me throughout. My brother, Edwin Koolhoven, and his family. And of course, my partner in life, Casper Fischer, our son, Daniel, and his opa, Paul Fischer.